On this episode, we chat with virologist Dr. Joy Teeravechyan about her work on some cutting-edge science.
So if you ever wanted more insight into Thailand's scientific credentials, you'll dig this episode of the Bangkok Podcast.
Sawadee krap, this is the Bangkok Podcast. My name is Greg Jorgensen, a Canadian who came to Thailand in 2001 to study the long-lost art of air conditioning appreciation, and I think I'm about ready to get my degree.
No doubt about that. And I'm Ed Knuth, an American who came to Thailand on a one-year teaching contract almost 22 years ago. Fell in love with the joy I felt after being trapped by a torrential monsoon and realizing that I was wearing flip-flops. So I never left.
Nice. Yeah, the opposite is awful when you're like, well, I'm trapped here and I got these new shoes on. I can't leave. And jeans.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. It's funny. I saw a guy on Twitter. Greg and I are referencing the recent massive downpour that resulted in flooding in Bangkok, the worst in years. And I saw a guy on Twitter who got stuck in like expensive leather boots.
Ooh, no.
In the grimy, like flooding sewage water.
That was funny.
We want to say a quick thank you to one of our patrons, Todd Kuipers, who supports us at the show shout-out level. Stick around after our interview with a vaccine researcher here in Bangkok to hear how Todd almost got into a fight after he was mistaken for a missionary in northern Thailand.
Boom.
We want to give a big thanks to all of our patrons who support the show. Patrons get a whole bunch of cool stuff, including our ad-free regular show a day early, emails with behind-the-scenes photos of our interviews, access to our Discord server to chat with me, Greg, and other listeners around the world, and various other goodies. But best of all, patrons like Todd also get an unscripted, uncensored bonus episode every week where we riff on current events and Bangkok topics. We just finished recording this week's bonus show, and we chatted about the insane rainstorm last night that dumped 160 millimeters on Bangkok, and what that says about the future of water management in the city. A new rule being proposed that will allow foreigners to buy land for the right price, and the return to Bangkok of Guns N' Roses, which will be the first concert that Greg's son ever goes to.
Woo!
To learn how to become a patron, click the support button at the top of our website.
I'm just having a nightmare now that like 3 songs in, he's going to be like, Daddy, I'm bored. It's too loud. Here, look at my phone. Watch YouTube for the next 2 hours.
Right. Yeah, he's like, where's the button I can press? Like, I want to fast forward.
Yeah, right. Shut up and sit down. I'm grounded. All right. Well, as always, if you have something interesting to say or a show idea or a joke and just want to say hi, head to BangkokPodcast.com and click the little microphone button on the bottom right to leave us a voicemail that we'll play on the show. And a quick programming note, believe it or not, listeners, this is the last episode of Season 5. I can't believe it's gone this long. So next week, I'm going to be away for a few days, so we figured that was a nice little break. So there's not going to be a show next week. Ed and I are going to take a little break. But then the week after that, we will be back with the first episode of Season 6, which, damn, again, hard to believe.
Yeah, I didn't think I was going to live this long, man. I didn't think I was going to make it to Season 6.
That's right. So we won't see you next week, but we will see you the week after. All right. Well, in this episode, we are very excited to be able to chat with Kun Samaporn Teeravechyan, a.k.a. Dr. Joy. Now, Joy is a virologist who works for the National Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, which falls under the umbrella agency of the National Science and Technology Development Agency, which is Thailand's National Science and Technology Research Agency. Now, this is a really interesting topic for me because us wacky foreigners don't often get much insight into these types of things here unless we happen to work there. Now, in the past, I've had casual conversations with Thai researchers, mathematicians, and scientists of all types, but have always wondered just what it is like to work in these highly specialized academic fields in Thailand, which is why I was so happy to chat with Dr. Joy. Now, she works on a number of really cool projects, but right now she's part of a team working on the development of a Thai made nasal vaccine for COVID and a bunch of other really cool projects. So, to chat about this and what it's like to work as a researcher here in Thailand, here is my conversation with Dr. Joy Teeravechyan. All right, my guest this weekend is one of my brand new friends. I literally just met her on the computer a few minutes ago. We are talking to Dr. Samaporn Teeravechyan. Did I even say that remotely correctly?
It was very good.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome to the show, Doctor. Can I call you Joy?
Yes, please.
Okay, Joy is your nickname. Well, Joy, welcome to the Bangkok podcast, and thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here today.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you because you seem much cooler than I am because I'm a huge nerd, and I love learning about science things. And you are specifically working on something that is really, really relevant right now, considering the past 2 years of hellscape that we've lived through. And you are a medical researcher who's working on a COVID vaccine.
Yes.
I know that's probably a lot more complicated than that, but is that roughly the area that you're focused on right now?
More or less, yes. I'm actually a virologist, so not all of my work time is devoted to vaccine research. But yes, a lot of our work is basic virology research, which is really the basis for understanding the life cycle of the virus, how it works, so that you can design a good and effective vaccine.
Right. Okay. So that's awesome. I want to get more into that in a minute. But first of all, tell us, you were born in Thailand. Where did you go to school, and how did you end up working where you are now?
Well, I actually wasn't born in Thailand. I was born in Hong
Oh,
Kong. So my
see.
dad was a career diplomat for Thailand before he retired. So I actually spent most of my early life as an expat, pretty much. Moved
I know.
around in several countries, but I did graduate 12th grade here in Thailand. And then I went off to the US for undergrad and grad school. So, and then once I finished my PhD, I came back to Thailand to work. So,
Wow. Okay.
yeah.
Sorry, I made an assumption, which is ridiculous because I hate it when people do it about me being an
Oh no,
expat in
it's
Thailand
fine.
too. So you got your doctorate in virology? Is that a thing?
Yes, although the actual name of my program was Biological Sciences in Public Health.
Oh, right
A
on.
fancy name. Yes. I did my research in HIV, and so
Oh,
then I
okay.
came back to Thailand. Yes.
Interesting. So I'm really curious about the academic and research landscape in Thailand. Now, I'm not sure where you work now, or you used to work at the NTSDA.
NASDA, that's the National Science and Technology Development Agency. That's where I still work. That's the only place I've ever worked, actually.
Okay. Well, tell me about that because I don't think I think a lot of laymen and normal folks like myself understand how this works in Thailand. What is that organization? How does it work, and what does it do?
So basically, it's very much similar to the National Institutes of Health in the United States. So it's a government research institute. Well, NASDA actually is an umbrella organization for several research institutes. So I work at Biotech, which is the abbreviation for National Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, which is a pretty
Wow.
long name. Then there's MTech, which does materials research, NECTech, which does electronics and computer research, Nanotech, which does nanotechnology research, and so on and so forth. There are several new institutes popping up for energy and things like that as well. And so basically, each of these research institutes have agendas that are set by national policy, and so it's a bit different from academic research labs where say a professor comes in and they get their lab space and they pick their own topic and do whatever research they want to do. So
I see.
basically, yeah, here we get, once we join the research institute, we join labs that are already set up,
Okay.
and we do the research that is set for that lab, basically.
All right. All right. And this is a government agency, so it's funded by government money?
Mostly, yes. Although in recent years, Thailand has been trying to get the private sector to invest more in R&D, but still most of it is government.
Oh, wow. This is fascinating because, as a foreigner, where that doesn't speak or read fluent Thai, we're sort of locked out of a lot of this. So when we think about what Thailand is, can offer us, science and research and stuff is not really where we think, right? We're here for the beaches or the tropical weather or the swimming pool in my condo or whatever, and the lovely people and all that stuff too. But high tech science research is not really something people think about when they think of Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the landscape of that like here? Are there a lot of people like you doing this great work? Are there like a lot of these organizations that are set up to promote science and these cutting edge technology research?
Well, first of all, probably the reason why you wouldn't think of Thailand as a major research hub is because we do face a lot of disadvantages. In terms of funding, obviously, we've recently reached 1% GDP in terms of investment in research and development. But in terms of sheer volume, that's still very much less than what, say, the United States or Europe, various countries in Europe invest in their research. And so the amount of money we get for our research is first much less. But then we have to import our research reagents and supplies from overseas. And these also all have to pass through distributors who, of course, take a cut on top of that and all the import charges. So actually, the prices for the materials that we need and the reagents that we need actually cost about 2 or 3 times more than what they would cost in the United States. And of course,
like buying a BMW.
Yes, and of course, because the companies are located in the United States, sometimes you get your materials overnight, but instead in Thailand, we have to go through our distributors, we have to go through customs, and so we usually wait at least 2 weeks. 1 month is normal, 3 months happens as well. So the rate at which we can respond quickly to cutting edge science or new outbreaks and things like that is relatively slower than what you would manage in other countries.
Right. So you say it just the threshold just hit 1%. Is that's low, but is it better than it used to be? Is it growing?
It is growing. It is growing. And definitely, I think we've been seeing much more private investment into R&D as well. So it's a very good and very promising sort of trend, although it's also difficult given that Thailand's politics are not entirely stable. And so when you think of research, it's something that doesn't really give dividends within a few months or a year. But if you think about how long Thai politicians stick around for in parliament, for example, before they, we have to redo the elections. Yeah. Basically, so the amount of time they have to show results is very short.
That's interesting. So all this political mumbo jumbo still affects you, even as a researcher that's totally removed from it.
Right.
This is something that I've discussed with my friends before, and it's something that, like, when you look at a country like China, they've got a one-party system, and they can plan 10 years ahead, 50 years ahead, 100 years ahead, because nothing's ever going to change. You take it down a notch and you've got most Western democracies, and they might be able to plan 4 or 8 years ahead, which is less. So even their long-term agendas sometimes get derailed or undone or revoked. And then you look at Thailand. Who knows?
1 or 2 years. Yeah.
So do you find that really frustrating to people in your field? Sort of, are you at the mercy of this sort of unpredictable political system here?
I think for most researchers, that is a major problem. Fortunately or not for us as virologists, there are always new things coming in. And on the one hand, it's difficult for us to establish a niche just because we're always chasing the funding. And so, H5N1 influenza outbreak, okay, the money comes in to do H1N1 or H7N9, then COVID, then MERS, African swine fever, porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. So it's hard for us to become a lab that, they say, okay, this is a lab that is known for their flu work. But it's hard because the funding is always moving away from what we're doing and going to new things. But on the other hand, we're really lucky because it's something that's almost always in the public consciousness. Whether it's human virus or an animal virus, there's always something going around. So there's work for us most of the time, which is much luckier than other researchers who do, say, mycology or TB or diseases that are always around, but people just are tired of funding this ongoing work.
An immediate threat, right?
Yes.
So it's like, we'll forget about that. The only thing I can think of is that line in Men in Black when Will Smith freaks out because there's an alien spaceship about to vaporize the Earth. And Tommy Lee Jones goes, there's always an alien spaceship about to vaporize the Earth. So I think as virologists, you must be like, there's always like the next disease is just around the corner that we've got to be prepared for. So let's talk specifically about the work being done on viruses now, specifically with COVID. You hear in the newspaper every few weeks, there's some story about a nasal vaccine that you spray up your nose and you're protected from coronavirus, and presumably that technology or that process, whatever you call it, can be adapted and used in other methods for other diseases as well. So are you involved in that work?
Not in the ones that are appearing in the news, I don't think.
Okay.
But the one I'm working on is an intranasal vaccine for COVID-19. Yes. It's sort of like the Vaxzevria, which is the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which is an adenovirus-based intramuscular vaccine. So basically a shot in the arm. But ours is designed to be given intranasally.
Why? What's the advantage of that?
The virus is something that we contract by inhalation. Mm-hmm. And so that is where the virus enters our respiratory tract and replicates in there. So basically a vaccine that enters the respiratory tract as well and stimulates the immune response there is more likely to be able to prevent both the virus increasing in large amounts such that that person becomes infectious. So basically, it would cut down on transmission, and then it reduces the amount of virus in the body, so that cuts down the disease. So because what we've been seeing so far with intramuscular vaccines is that it doesn't really prevent transmission that much. So our hope in the beginning with by going the intranasal route is to reduce both intranasal and transmission and disease. Right.
Now, and again, another dumb question from a non-scientist. This seems like a no-brainer. Why wasn't this the first type of vaccine that they developed?
It's actually an excellent question. And the reason is because the vaccines that are given in the muscle, or, arm shots are things that people are very familiar with. It's very easy to develop. There are formulations. It's basically very well established. So if you want to push out a quick vaccine, the intramuscular is the way to go. So when we started ours, we knew that we had no way to catch up with intramuscular vaccines. But if the vaccines that came out worked well, then that's fine. That's the end of it.
Right.
But if not, then we felt that our intranasal approach would bring up the rear, basically.
Right. So it's a more effective way of quickly combating the disease, but it would take longer for research and development and production and distribution.
Yes, basically, because actually there are very few intranasal vaccines out there. There's, I guess, flu myths, which people would know, but in general, people are more familiar with intramuscular vaccines, and nurses and doctors are more comfortable administering those vaccines. So logistic-wise and in very many ways, it's much harder to push out.
Interesting. Okay. So what's the testing process like? I mean, we all know that these things, they first have to be tested on animals, and then you move into human trials, and then it's ready for production. But does each country have their own like process and rules and regulations and do's and do nots for testing, or is it sort of a global thing that's decided?
It's a global thing, really. So you have agencies and organizations like the WHO releasing guidelines on how vaccines and various drugs need to be studied and how their safety needs to be assured before they can become commercial products. So there are very specific guidelines that everyone would follow, basically.
I see. Okay. So Thailand is no different than
Right.
Australia or Belgium or whatever.
Well, I mean, national guidelines would certainly differ. Although if you would think about preparing and developing a vaccine that you would want to send overseas, obviously just using it in your own country would be extremely expensive in terms of, how much you invest into the development of the vaccine.
Right.
So ultimately, you would want to make sure that you follow global standards.
I see. Right. So if you did it the Thai way and only made it for Thai people, and you spent $2 billion to develop it, you've only got a potential pool of 70 million customers. Right. Right. Okay. That makes sense. So what other things is Thailand working on? Like, are there any outstanding medical developments or achievements that Thailand has done or is working on that people would be surprised to learn about?
I must start with a disclaimer that I would not really know everything that's going on in Thailand. And
fair enough, yeah.
To anyone listening who has some extremely exciting work out there that I didn't mention, I am extremely sorry. But
yes, let us know what's happening.
So I'm only just mostly aware of what work sort of intersects my way. And so what I am aware of is that we do have a very strong malaria drug program. With some very promising drug that is being tested in animals. And we are also, well, not we, but another team obviously is working on dengue vaccine, and they've been doing it for quite some time.
Yeah.
It is also one of the major programs that is being pushed by the government. And I think the COVID vaccine obviously has seen a much stronger push in these past 2 years. And hopefully what we learn and trailblaze by trying to get this into clinical trials will be very helpful for them eventually, simply because Thailand as a whole has very little experience in terms of developing and pushing a vaccine all the way through human testing. So even the regulatory agencies are still new to this as well. So yes, it's a learning process for everyone involved.
I assume there are many other countries in the world that are working on the intranasal vaccine as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So is there a bit of a race to be the first successful one?
There probably is, and we're probably not in the running. But because there's a vaccine being developed in India, for example, that uses also an adenovirus vector from developed in the United States, and also China has one ongoing work as well. And I think they recently announced they've done a lot of testing with their intranasal and inhalation vaccines as well.
So let's talk about the landscape more about of research and academia in Thailand. Recently for my job, I was down at Chulalongkorn University, and I was I was interviewing some materials scientists. And they were doing some incredibly cool work with bioplastics and other materials that are made from natural products that break down naturally to try and replace plastic in their food packaging and the masks and all the stuff that we wear. And, I was just really amazed at some of the really, really cool work that was going on right there. And these people were really sharp. They studied all over the world. The stuff they were coming up with and talking about, to me, sounded incredibly cutting edge. And again, it's probably no big deal for you, but for someone like myself who's not exposed to that, it made me really proud that Thailand was my adopted home. I was like, damn, there's doing some really cool stuff here. And, Thailand's, these kids are going to make Thailand proud one day. Do you get that same feeling from knowing the people you work with and your own work? Like, is there great things ahead for Thailand in this regard?
I really think so too. For example, in regards to the scholarship program, a lot of students get sent out overseas and are gradually coming back. They're taking positions in universities and teaching new generations of students. Even our biotech, for example, I think more than 50% are scholarship students who were sent to study overseas. The environment is, as I feel it, very dynamic. Biotech is only about 30-ish, 35 years or so years old. So we don't have quite the hierarchy, that set hierarchy that older universities do. So at least at the various research institutes at NASDA, I feel that the environment is extremely dynamic. It feels very much like doing research back in grad school, environment-wise, although money-wise and bureaucracy-wise, it's a different matter. But we're constantly getting new researchers, new blood, who have been trained in cutting-edge technologies, and they're coming back and picking up the slack for us once we start, starting to get old and we're sort of not too familiar with newer techniques and things like that. So there's a constant infusion of fresh blood and new ideas and people who are very excited about starting their research careers in Thailand.
Right. That's really good to hear. So I want to ask one thing, and I think maybe I have to ask it carefully and you have to answer carefully, but there's been a lot of talk over the past few years about Thailand's youth not seeing a future here and, really working to get out of Thailand. Is that something that you think about too? I mean, not you personally, but people in your industry, young people that are looking to make a career. Do they see Thailand as a legitimate long-term option, or is there just sort of like this overarching thought that we got to get out of here?
Well, not quite got to get out of here, but definitely we as a country need to do much better than this. For example, in Singapore, their civil servants get top wages simply because they see the importance of people in the public sector and their contribution to the development of their country. But right. In Thailand, civil servants and people like me who work in the public sector, we do not get, basically our salaries are not competitive when you compare it with the private sector or going overseas. While biology research, wet lab work is not quite as affected, but you can imagine for things like computer engineers and computer programmers, we need those too for bioinformatics work and things like that. And those labs face great difficulties in retaining people simply because, they can get a programming job elsewhere. It's much more fun and they get paid much more. I think priorities need to shift a bit towards trying to retain quality people and attract quality people right. to these sectors.
I keep saying, man, it's going to be a better world when we get those stupid influencers off the front page with teachers and scientists as careers that kids look up to and aspire to.
Well, speaking of careers, though, I'm here today because back when I was in high school, the big news was Ebola, and there was a movie Outbreak at that time, and I thought that was the coolest thing. So that is one of the reasons why I'm a virologist. Hopefully in 10, 20 years' time, we'll get a boom in sciences as well.
Wow. My favorite movie is Die Hard. What do I want to be when I grow up? I want to jump off a building when it explodes or something. That's a great story. That's really cool. So then when we're talking about testing and getting a vaccine from like the research phase to actual production and distribution and sticking into my arm or squirting on my nose, I mean, is it as simple as just like injecting into a monkey and then saying, all right, he didn't die. Let's try a human. All right, he didn't die too. We're done. What's that process like? I imagine that's a extremely simplified version of it, but what is it like for you?
Well, the animal testing is obvious that you need to check and make sure that it's safe in animals, that it's immunogenic, meaning that it stimulates a good immune response, and that it's protective, meaning that this immune response actually manages to control the virus and prevents it from causing disease in the animals. For example, the safety testing is much more involved than we expected. It needs to show that it is safe for testing in humans. So it's not easy to say that, okay, I put this vaccine into a rat, and now that means that it's safe in humans. So there's a lot that goes into the design of the experiment in rats before anyone will dare say that, okay, let's go to humans. So basically, you've got this animal that's, a few 100 grams,
Uh-huh.
and it's supposed to replicate the safety of a vaccine in humans. Basically, we actually have to give the same amount of material that you would give a human, 50 kilogram or 70 kilogram human, into that rat and make sure that it's safe. And if it's
Like a proportional amount, right?
no, not proportional, exact same amount.
Really? So
Yes.
the same dose you would give me,
yes,
who wishes he weighed 70 kilograms, you
yes.
would give to a tiny little mouse?
A rat, yes.
A rat. Okay. Wow.
Right. And
Wow.
so if the plan is to give a prime boost, so 2 shots into a human, then we would give it 3 times in the rat,
Oh,
and
wow.
then have to see, look at all the tissues, look at it for any sign of disease at all, for example, over multiple time points, and the vaccine needs to be prepared the same way as it would be prepared for humans. And so we actually hit a stumbling block there because we tried to do the safety very early on, basically last year, before we started production of the vaccine, just to save time and to try to push this out as quickly as possible. And as it turns out, the manufacturing process changed once we tried to move into the GMP production in a factory, basically. And so once things changed, for example, some of the reagents are different, or the materials that we use, if it
Right.
comes into contact with liquids, some things might leach out differently. And so basically, we found ourselves at the point where we need to redo the safety testing all over again.
Oh, man.
Yes. And there are massive regulatory documents that need to be prepared. And the ways that it must be written is extremely complicated and extremely detailed.
Jeez.
And basically, probably thousands upon thousands of pages of written material for a single vaccine, which we are very slowly plodding through the process of learning how to write.
Wow. I thought the paperwork for getting my visa was complicated.
No, this is much harsher.
Okay. So then it moves into human trials eventually. And I imagine
Not,
that's
not yet, because then you need to check and make sure that the vaccine is stable for however long it needs to be kept in storage, for a year, 2 years, and that's a whole long story that I'm still working on. So it's a massive headache.
I bet. Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
That's crazy. So then finishing up here, in 5 years, will people who doing what you do now be standing on the shoulders of giants, i.e. you? I mean, will they use the work you're doing now to make bigger and better and more effective vaccines in the future in Thailand?
That is definitely the hope, because given how the pandemic is looking to become steady now, although things can change at any time. And we are definitely behind the curve when it comes to vaccine manufacture. Our hope is really to trailblaze in terms of looking at all the bottlenecks in the process of vaccine development in terms of infrastructure, pushing our way through with the regulatory issues, and paving a road for future vaccine development such that in the future, whether it will be a vaccine based on the same technology or similar technologies, hopefully we and other people who are going through this process, not just us as vaccine developers, but people who do the animal testing and the challenge and the manufacturing, we will have things in place for the next pandemic, because there will certainly be one. Thailand will be be able to prepare its own vaccine much more quickly.
Right. Well, Dr. Joy, thank you so much for coming on and talking about that. It's fascinating, and like I said, there's this whole area of Thailand that regular, normal, dumb people like myself don't know about. So it's great to get some insight into what's going on. And continued success with your work, and keep doing a good job protecting us from the next alien spaceship, which is inevitably going to come down the pipe eventually.
Thank you very much. It was my great pleasure to be here today.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Man, I love this interview. She's a great guest. I really wish I knew more about science in Thailand. As someone who teaches here and has taught here for a long time, and also just what everyone knows, Thai kids are very good at math and science.
Yeah.
I know it's a little bit of a cliche and a stereotype, but I think the data backs it up, at least for Bangkok schools. I know Thailand has an issue of, rural schools aren't as good. But even though I hear a lot about Thai students' achievements in math and science, I rarely hear about Thai scientists making major discoveries or big achievements. It's like, so I always wish I understood more the way professional science works in Thailand.
Right. And that's why I was so interested to do it, because you think of Thailand, you don't think like, oh, research. That's not, it's not like you think of that when you think of any other country either, but, Thailand is just so overwhelmed with this reputation for beaches and tourism and stuff like that.
Oh, right. No, of course. But I'm with you. Since I have an academic career, I know that, on average, Thai students are good at science and math. But then, like I said, I rarely hear about Thai scientists. It could be a question of maybe there's just poor press coverage. But I know in the interview you touched on other possible reasons. Right.
We touched on that a little bit about how she said there was funding issues and things like that. And if that's a tale as old as time, to borrow a line from Beauty and the Beast. The scientists and the researchers are always fighting for more funding, more money, and stuff like that. And if they don't get it, it's hard to rise to the top of this extremely competitive field. And as I also said in the interview, in recent months for my job, I've been out at some labs at Chula and labs in, some of the universities north of Bangkok. And there's some really, really cool cutting edge stuff being done by some brilliant Thai researchers. But we just never hear about them. They're never on TV. They're never talked about. And
that's right.
Maybe they just don't have the resources they need to take things to the next level. But it sounds like Dr. Joy, at least, and her team and her colleagues are doing some really, really neat stuff.
Yeah, that's great. It's good to hear. She was a good guest.
Yeah, that was really cool. So thank you, Joy, for coming on the show, and looking forward to snorting your work up my nose. That's a fairly odd
thing to say to someone.
I would take that as a high compliment. You make something and I snort it, I have full trust in you. Yeah, but thanks again, Joy. That was great. All right, let's get into some love, loathe, or live with, where one of us picks a particular aspect of living in Bangkok, which we then discuss and decide if it's something that we love about living here, loathe about living here, or have come to accept as something that we just have to learn to live with no matter how we feel about it. And last time, Ed asked me what I thought about chilled towels at restaurants, so this week it's my turn. So, Ed, you've been to parks in Thailand, out and about, walking around, riding a bike, like Lumpini and other small parks?
I have been, occasionally, certainly.
Now, I don't think you've ever used these things, but I'm curious what goes through your mind when you see them. What do you think about these brightly painted sort of exercise, quote-unquote, machines you see? Like the little things you stand in and you can like take giant strides. And like these little weird machines that you often see old people using that are sort of meant to provide exercise, but look more like some bizarre, I don't know, like modern art sculpture that.
Dude, I know what you're talking about. And in general, we've talked about how there's not enough Thai parks.
Yeah.
But we haven't talked about the facilities at Thai parks usually are not very good. I mean, the parks themselves might be nice, but when you look at the exercise equipment, it's not good. It's not normal. It's not enticing. It's not something that makes me like, hey, I want to try that out.
Right. It's always some rusted, half broken piece of equipment.
That's right.
I don't think there's, maybe this isn't even a love loathe or live with, but I just find it so goofy that anyone would like think of them as serious exercise things. Like
that's right.
They're just so funny. And my son always goes on them and, tries to play on them like they're playground equipment, but I'm not even sure they're meant to be taken seriously. I don't know what they're there for.
No, they're okay. Yeah. Listeners, just to be clear, we're not just randomly kind of bitching and moaning. It's a little bit almost like it's a joke.
Yeah, kind of. Like, here's a thing where you can pretend you're walking at a, next to a walking track at a park.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't get it. And it's like this old, like this little, bench press machine that's got 400-year-old cables that are all rusted and broken on it. So, for me, I'm a live with these kind of things, but they always make me giggle and go like, why do you bother? Just
I mean, I guess technically I loathe them because I would never use them, but it's such a small thing. It's I can avoid it. But it's it's funny in the U.S. we have places like Venice Beach, Muscle Beach,
right,
where there are these guys going to work out, and if you look at pictures of that or video, it's not like they have super sophisticated equipment, but they have like functioning, good, reasonably modern equipment.
Right.
So you can actually go there and get a real workout, and it's Instagram friendly. But for some reason, the mini gyms, outdoor gyms at Thai parks are usually pretty sad.
Pretty lame. Yeah. I'm going to take a little like plaque around that says like, call it like Colors in the Park, by artist, and then put a price and like put it on the ground in front of it like it's a modern art installation or something like that.
It might do better. It might do better at that than as exercise equipment.
That's funny.
Okay, so as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, we'd like to say thank you to Todd Kuipers for lending us his support at the show shoutout level. And Greg, what did you find out about Todd?
Well, and as it turns out, I'm not sure if you know Todd, but he is a very, very old friend of mine. He is actually the brother-in-law of our friend and former guest, Dan Fraser, who has been on the show before.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, he lives in Calgary, and my hometown, and I never met him when I was in Calgary. I met him in Bangkok, but he's an incredibly cool guy, and he recently became a patron, which we thank him for. He has got stories, man. He's one of those dudes that's just so smart and so literate and so funny, and he's got really, really cool stories. So I asked him to tell us one for the podcast, and he wrote back and he goes, I have a funny-ish story. When my wife Sue and I were up north in Doi Mae Salong, which is one of my favorite spots in all of Thailand. I love Doi Mae Salong, right up on the border.
Cool.
He said, I had an old school Garmin GPS. This was about 20 years ago. And I used it to map the area while we rode around back roads. I did ride by a few guys smuggling some yaba in from Burma after dark. But the funny part was when I was asking for the names of the villages I rode through. I had a notebook that I'd scribble notes on locations for the map build I was doing. Anyway, after a couple of weeks of this, Sue and I were at the Central Market talking with a few people. One guy suddenly came out of the crowd, marched up to us, grabbed my notebook out of the motorbike basket, flipped through it, glared at me, flipped through it some more, and then threw it back into the basket and stomped off. It was a bit alarming. So a bit later, I figured out what happened. He thought we were missionaries. For weeks, him and his wife, they were a clean-cut early 30s couple, had gone out after our day teaching at the school, wearing white-collared shirts and khakis. There's your first mistake, Todd. The notebook was suspiciously small, black, and Gideon-esque. Before I clued in a few times, people immediately walked away when I pulled the book out. I did track down the aggressive gent later and cleared up any missionary vibe we were giving off. So yeah, that's funny. I wonder if these guys were more scared about having the drug smuggling routes busted and being recorded, or being lectured at about Jeebas.
That's interesting. I didn't know. I'm not surprised that there would be some people would have a negative attitude towards missionaries. But I've never heard that before. But that's a great story, man.
That's funny.
I mean, you've gone up north and kind of wandered the jungles more than I have, but I really wish I had more experience just outside of Bangkok. I've talked about it a lot. I just don't travel that much, and I certainly don't. I normally don't just have weeks of time to just wander up country.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, I think, to be honest with you, Todd, here, I think you probably should have had shown a bit more caution. Because I mean, if I was up in the northern border areas, I wouldn't be walking around taking photos of people and writing details down. You never know, right? There's some pretty gnarly dudes up there.
True that.
Especially dressed like a missionary. I mean, yeah, you can see where the guy was mistaking you wrong. But I'm glad you're safe anyway, Todd. And actually, guess what, Ed? Todd is in Bangkok right now as we speak. And,
for reals, that's great.
Yeah, we're hopefully going to be going on a bike ride in a few weeks, so
cool.
That'll be cool. Anyway, thanks for your support, Todd. I'm glad you are have moved on from your old Garmin and a notebook, and probably take notes on an iPhone these days. Make it a bit more subtle and less prone for confusion.
That's right. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah, thanks, man.
A final thanks to all of our patrons who support the show. Patrons get a ton of cool perks and the warm, fuzzy feeling knowing that they're helping support the show. Find out more by clicking support on our website. And connect with us online. We're Bangkok Podcast on social media, bangkokpodcast.com on the web, or simply bangkokpodcast@gmail.com. We love hearing from our listeners and always reply to our messages.
Totes my goats. You can also listen to each episode on YouTube, and you can send us a voicemail through our website that we'll feature on the show, or even reach out to me directly on Twitter, where I am BKK Greg. So thank you for listening, everyone. Take it easy out there, and we'll see you back here, not next week, but the week after.
For sure.
First can of Hogarth and Rosé down. The big question is, should I go for a second can?
Wild man, should I go for another can?
Maybe I'll save it for tomorrow night, Friday night. Get crazy.
Like, what is it? Okay, what is it like in the Jorgensen household on Friday night? Is it like you and your wife are like, it's Friday night? Like,
no.
I
already know what you're going to say. No, it's exactly the same as every other night. In bed by 8:30, and then Dad stays up later than normal.